The candle in Alina Whitmore's hand shook as the wind tore through the broken window of the carriage house. She had less than 1 hour to reach the Render estate before the doors closed for the night, and if she failed, her aunt would lose the only home she had left. Rain soaked through her thin shawl as she ran across the muddy path, clutching a folded letter against her chest like it was the last piece of hope in the world. Her aunt, Constance Whitmore, lay sick in bed that very evening, too weak to attend the grand ball she had been invited to for years but never had the means to properly enter. The invitation was not the problem. The debt was. A merchant named Roland Pike had lent the Whitmore family money 3 years ago, and now his patience had run out. He wanted his money by sunrise, or he would take the modest cottage that was all they owned. The only person who could help was a distant family friend attending the ball that night, a solicitor named Mr. Foley, who held papers that could delay the payment if signed before midnight. Alina had no gown fit for a ball. She had no jewels, no lace gloves, no elegant shoes. What she had was a plain gray dress, sturdy boots, and a determination that refused to bend. She was not going to dance. She was not going to be seen. She simply needed to slip into the crowd, find Mr. Foley, get his signature, and leave before anyone noticed a woman without a fortune had dared to walk through the front doors of the most celebrated house in the county. The Render estate rose out of the darkness like a mountain of light. Every window glowed with gold, and carriages lined the drive for what seemed like a mile. Alina's heart pounded as she stepped past the iron gates, praying that the guards checking invitations would not look too closely at her plain appearance. She held up the invitation that belonged to her aunt, and to her relief, the guard barely glanced at her before waving her through. Inside, the ballroom stunned her. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, and the floor shone so brightly that it looked like still water. Women in silk gowns of blue, rose, and ivory moved like flowers in a summer wind, each one dressed to be noticed, each one dripping with jewels that could feed a village for a year. Alina felt every eye that passed over her, felt the whispers that followed her plain gray dress like a shadow. She kept her chin lifted anyway. She had not come here to be admired. She had come here to save her family. She scanned the crowd for Mr. Foley's familiar round face and silver spectacles, but the ballroom was too vast, too crowded, too loud with laughter and music. Minutes slipped away. She checked the clock on the far wall, its golden hands creeping toward 11. She had less than an hour before the last chance to find him would disappear, and Mr. Pike's men would be waiting outside her aunt's cottage at first light. It was then that she felt it, a strange stillness settling over a portion of the room like a wave pulling back before it crashed. She turned and found the source. A man stood near the grand staircase, tall, dressed in deep charcoal with no unnecessary ornament, his dark eyes fixed directly on her. He was the only person in the entire ballroom who was not performing for someone else's attention. Every other person in that room adjusted their posture when watched. He did not. Alina did not know yet that this was Duke Alastair Render, master of the very house she stood in, the man every unmarried woman in the county had tried and failed to charm for 3 seasons running. She only knew that his gaze made her stomach twist with unease, because attention was the last thing she wanted tonight. She turned quickly and moved deeper into the crowd, weaving between groups of chattering guests, searching desperately for Mr. Foley's silver spectacles. A cluster of young noblemen blocked her path near the refreshment table, and one of them, a stout young lord with a wine glass already half empty, turned and looked her up and down with open curiosity. "You are new," he said, not unkindly, but loudly enough that several heads turned. "I do not believe we have been introduced." "I am not here to be introduced," Alina said quickly, trying to step around him. "I apologize, I am looking for someone." "A woman without jewels searching through a ballroom at this hour," another lord said, smiling like he had found something amusing to pass the evening. "Now that is a story worth hearing." Alina felt her cheeks burn, not from embarrassment at her appearance, but from the ticking clock inside her chest that these men could not understand. Every second they delayed her was a second closer to losing everything. She opened her mouth to excuse herself again when a voice, calm and low, cut through the small crowd. "Gentlemen, the lady said she is searching for someone. Perhaps instead of blocking her path, you might help her find them." The stout lord's face paled slightly, and the group parted like curtains pulled open. Elena turned and found the same dark eyes from across the room now standing directly in front of her. Up close, the Duke was even more imposing, his presence quiet but absolute, the kind of authority that did not need raised words to be obeyed. He did not smile, but there was nothing cold in his expression either. He simply looked at her the way no one had looked at her all evening, as though she were a person and not a curiosity. "Thank you," Elena said, startled but grateful, already stepping back to continue her search. "I do not wish to trouble you further, Your Grace." "You know who I am," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "Everyone in this room knows who you are," Elena replied honestly. "I simply have very little time tonight, and I must find a man named Mr. Foley before the hour grows too late." Something flickered across the Duke's face, curiosity sharpening into interest. Most women who spoke to him wanted his attention, his name, his fortune. This woman wanted none of it. She wanted to leave as quickly as possible to find someone else entirely. "Foley, the solicitor," he said. "He stepped into my study not 10 minutes ago to discuss a matter with my steward. I can take you to him if you allow it." Elena hesitated only a moment. Time was slipping through her fingers like water, and pride was a luxury she could not afford tonight. "I would be grateful, Your Grace." He led her through a side door, away from the noise and the chandeliers, down a quiet corridor lined with portraits of stern ancestors watching from gilded frames. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, though Elena felt his gaze return to her more than once, studying her the way a man studies something he cannot quite place. She did not fill the silence with nervous chatter the way other women might have. She simply walked, focused, purposeful, her mind already on the papers she needed signed. "May I ask what brings such urgency?" the Duke finally said, "on a night meant for celebration." Elena considered lying, considered giving some small, polite excuse the way society expected, but something about his directness made her answer honestly instead. "My family is in debt, Your Grace. If Mr. Foley does not sign certain papers before midnight, my aunt will lose her home by morning. I did not come tonight to dance or to be seen. I came because there was nowhere else to turn." The Duke stopped walking. Elena turned back, uncertain if she had said too much, revealed too much of the desperation she had tried so hard to hide beneath a calm exterior. But his expression held no judgment, only a quiet, sharpening attention, as though she had just become the most interesting person he had spoken to in years. "Then we should not waste another moment," he said, and something in his voice had changed, gentler now, edged with an urgency that matched her own. He led her the rest of the way down the corridor at a quicker pace, and Elena found herself hurrying to keep up, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the debt anymore. They reached the study, and through the half-open door, Elena caught sight of Mr. Foley's silver spectacles glinting in the candlelight. Relief flooded through her so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled. She turned to thank the Duke, to tell him she could manage the rest herself, but he was already stepping into the room ahead of her. "Foley," the Duke said, "there is a young lady here who requires your signature on a matter of some urgency. I trust you can spare a few minutes before the hour grows too late." Mr. Foley looked up, startled to see the Duke himself standing in the doorway and even more startled to see Elena beside him. "Your Grace," he said, rising quickly. Of course. Miss Whitmore, is it not? Your aunt sent word to me weeks ago about this matter. I have been waiting to hear from someone." Elena stepped forward, pulling the folded letter from beneath her shawl with trembling hands. "The payment is due at sunrise. My aunt hoped you could delay the terms or find some way to protect the cottage until we are able to gather the sum." Mr. Foley took the letter, scanning it quickly, his expression growing thoughtful. This is within my ability to resolve, yes. Give me a few minutes to draft the necessary document, and I will have it ready for signature before midnight. Relief washed over Alina so completely that she had to steady herself against the edge of a nearby chair. For the first time all evening, the tight knot in her chest began to loosen. She turned to thank the Duke properly, only to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something between curiosity and quiet admiration. You came to a ball unadorned, searching through a room full of strangers to save your family's home, he said softly. I have never seen anything quite like it. Alina felt heat rise to her cheeks, unused to such direct words. It was necessity, your grace, not courage. Perhaps, he said, but I have watched many women walk through that ballroom tonight dressed in silk and jewels, performing for an audience they hoped would notice them. You walked through it caring for nothing but the people you love. I find that far more remarkable than anything silk could achieve. Before Alina could respond, Mr. Foley cleared his throat gently, holding out a freshly written document and a pen. If you would sign here, Miss Whitmore, the matter will be settled tonight. Alina took the pen with a steady hand, though her heart was pounding for an entirely different reason now. As she signed her name, she was aware of the Duke standing close beside her, watching with quiet interest, as though something in this small, desperate errand had shifted something inside him that no ballroom performance ever could. She did not know yet that word of her arrival, her plain gray dress, and her private conversation with the Duke had already begun to spread through the ballroom like fire through dry grass. She did not know that by morning, every nobleman in the county would know her name. All she knew, as she folded the signed document and pressed it against her chest, was that her aunt's home was safe for one more night, and that the man beside her was looking at her as though she were the only person in the entire house worth seeing. Thank you, your grace, she said quietly. You did not have to help me tonight. No, he agreed, his voice low. I did not have to, but I wanted to. Outside the study, the music of the ball drifted faintly through the walls, bright and endless, oblivious to the quiet moment unfolding in the candle-lit room. Alina had come to the Render estate that night to save her family, expecting nothing more than a signature and a swift, unnoticed exit. She had not expected to leave with a debt of an entirely different kind, one owed to a man whose eyes had followed her from the moment she walked through the door, unadorned, unafraid, and utterly unaware that her life was about to change forever. As she turned to leave the study, the Duke's voice stopped her one final time. Miss Whitmore, he said, I do hope this will not be the last I see of you. Alina paused at the threshold, the folded document still warm in her hand, and for the first time that evening she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. That, your grace, is not entirely up to me. She stepped back into the corridor, unaware that behind her, the Duke remained still for a long moment, watching the space where she had stood, already certain that the woman in the plain gray dress had done something no jewel or silk gown had ever managed. She had made him forget, if only for a few minutes, every reason he had for avoiding the ballroom altogether. And somewhere across that glittering room, hidden among the crowd, a pair of sharp eyes belonging to a man named Lord Edmund Hale had already begun to take careful notice of everything that had just happened. Alina did not know it yet, but the hardest part of her night had not yet begun. The moment she stepped back through the ballroom doors, the whispers found her instantly, faster than she could have imagined, curling around her like smoke. She had entered unnoticed. She would not leave that way. And far across the room, near the tall windows overlooking the dark garden, Lord Edmund Hale set down his glass, straightened his coat, and began walking directly toward her with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Lord Edmund Hale moved through the crowd the way a hawk moves through open sky, unhurried, watchful, certain of his next move before he ever made it. He had seen the Duke lead an unknown woman out of the ballroom, and he had seen the Duke's face when they returned, a face Edmund had never once seen soften for any of the season's most celebrated beauties. Interest was a valuable thing to notice in a man like Alistair Render, and Edmund intended to understand exactly what had caused it. "Miss," he said, stepping directly into Alina's path with practiced charm, "forgive my boldness, but I could not help noticing you were absent from this room for some time, and then returned looking rather pleased with yourself. Might I ask what fortune found you tonight?" Alina studied him carefully before answering. He was handsome in a polished, deliberate way, his coat a shade too fine for a man simply attending a ball, his smile a shade too practiced. Something about him made the hair on her arms rise, though she could not name exactly why. "Nothing that would interest you, my lord," she said politely, attempting to step around him. "On the contrary," Edmund said, matching her step so she could not pass, "everything that interests the Duke interests me a great deal. We are old friends, you understand, practically brothers." Alina doubted that claim the moment it left his mouth, though she kept her expression neutral. "Then I am certain he would tell you himself, should he wish you to know." A flicker of irritation crossed Edmund's face before he smoothed it away with another smile. "Clever as well as unadorned. That is a rare combination in this room tonight." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret between old friends. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore, is it? I could not help but overhear your name mentioned near the study door. Your family holds a small property near the Eastern Road, does it not? I believe I have heard mention of certain difficulties surrounding it." Alina's stomach tightened. She had not given him her name. She had not spoken to him at all until this moment, and yet he already knew far more than a stranger should. "I do not see how my family's affairs concern you, my lord." "They do not yet," Edmund said smoothly, "but debts have a way of traveling through certain circles, Miss Whitmore. Merchants speak to solicitors, solicitors speak to men of business, and men of business on occasion speak to me." He straightened his cuffs with deliberate slowness, watching her reaction carefully. "Roland Pike is, in fact, an acquaintance of mine." The knot in Alina's chest returned instantly, tighter than before. Roland Pike was the very merchant who held her family's debt, the reason she had come to this ball in the first place. If this man knew Pike personally, then perhaps the paper she had just signed with Mr. Foley was not as safe as she had believed only minutes ago. "What exactly are you suggesting, my lord?" "Nothing at all tonight," Edmund said pleasantly, though his eyes held something colder beneath the polite surface. "I am simply saying that debts have owners, Miss Whitmore, and owners can be persuaded to sell what they hold, to the right buyer, for the right price. It would be a shame if such a small, quiet arrangement between your aunt and Mr. Pike found its way into hands less patient than his own." Before Alina could respond, a shift rippled through the nearby crowd, heads turning once again, this time toward the ballroom's grand entrance where the Duke had reappeared, his sharp gaze finding Alina within seconds despite the sea of guests between them. Edmund noticed it too, and his smile widened into something sharper, more calculating. "It seems your evening is not yet finished," he said, stepping back with an exaggerated bow. "Enjoy the rest of the ball, Miss Whitmore. I suspect it will be a memorable one for you." He turned and disappeared into the crowd before Alina could ask him anything further, leaving her standing alone with a new and far more dangerous fear settling over the relief she had felt only moments before. The Duke reached her within a minute, his expression sharpening the instant he saw her face. "You look troubled," he said quietly. "What happened?" Alina hesitated, unsure how much to share with a man she had known for less than an hour. However kind he had been to her, but the fear coiling in her chest was too large to carry alone, and something about his steady presence made her want to trust him. "A man approached me. Lord Hale, I believe he called himself. He knew about my family's debt before I told him anything. He said he knows the merchant who holds it, and that debts can be bought and sold to whoever wishes to hold them." The Duke's expression darkened, a stillness settling over him that Alina had not seen before, quiet but unmistakably serious. "Edmund Hale," he said, the name leaving his mouth like something distasteful. He is no friend of mine, whatever he may have told you. He collects debts the way other men collect art, not for the money, but for the power it gives him over people who owe him. If he has set his sights on your family's arrangement with this merchant, it is not out of casual curiosity." "What does he want with it?" Elena asked, though a cold understanding was already beginning to form in her mind. "Leverage," the Duke said simply. "Men like Hale use debt to bind people to them, to force choices that would never be made freely. If he believes there is something valuable to be gained by controlling your family's situation, he will move quickly to secure it." He paused, studying her carefully. "Has your aunt discussed marriage prospects for you recently, Miss Whitmore?" The question startled her. "No, we have had little time for such matters given our circumstances." "Then that may soon change," the Duke said grimly. "A woman with an unpaid debt and no immediate means of settling it becomes very useful to a man seeking a convenient marriage, particularly if that debt can be used to pressure her family into accepting an arrangement they would otherwise refuse." Elena felt the floor shift slightly beneath her, the relief of the signed document evaporating into a new and colder fear. She had thought signing the papers with Mr. Foley had ended the danger for the night. She had not considered that a man like Edmund Hale might see her family's misfortune as an opportunity rather than an obstacle. "What can I do?" she asked, adding how small her voice sounded. The Duke was quiet for a moment, his jaw tightening as he considered the problem with the same seriousness he might give to a matter of state. "Tonight, nothing more than what has already been done. Mr. Foley's document should hold for the immediate danger, but if Hale intends to purchase your family's debt directly from Pike, we must act before he has the opportunity." "We," Elena repeated softly, surprised by the word. The Duke met her eyes directly, and for a moment the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade entirely around them. "I do not intend to stand aside and watch a man like Edmund Hale use desperation as a weapon against someone who has done nothing but try to protect the people she loves. If you will permit it, I would like to help you resolve this properly, not with a hurried signature in a candle-lit study, but with something more permanent." Elena studied his face, searching for the calculation she had seen so plainly in Lord Hale's expression only minutes before. She found none. What she found instead was quiet, steady resolve, the kind that did not ask for anything in return. "Why would you do this for a stranger, Your Grace? You do not know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know a woman who walked into a ballroom full of people determined to impress each other, wearing nothing but honesty, because saving her family mattered more to her than anything silk or jewels could offer. That tells me more about a person than a season of formal introductions ever could." Before Elena could respond, the orchestra began a new piece, slower, more formal, the kind reserved for a dance that required partners to be announced. The Duke extended his hand toward her, and though every instinct told her this was not a night for dancing, something in his steady gaze made her hesitate before refusing. "Dance with me," he said quietly. "Not for the ballroom, not for the whispers that have already begun tonight, but because it will give us a few minutes to speak without half the room listening, and because I find that I would very much like to know more about the woman who walked in here unafraid." Elena glanced around the room and saw exactly what he meant. Dozens of eyes had already turned toward them, curiosity blooming into something closer to fascination. She was no longer invisible in this ballroom, whether she wished to be or not. Refusing him now would only draw more attention, more questions, more danger from men like Edmund Hale who were already circling. Accepting, at least, would give her a few precious minutes of protection within the safety of his presence. She placed her hand in his. The moment they began to move across the floor, Elena felt the weight of every gaze in the room settle upon them, but the Duke's steady presence beside her made the attention feel less like exposure and more like shelter. He danced the way he spoke, without excess, without performance, simply present and entirely focused on her. "Tell me about your family," he said as they moved through the steps. Not the debt, not the difficulty. Tell me who they are. Alina found herself speaking more freely than she had intended, describing her aunt's stubborn kindness, the small garden they kept behind the cottage, the quiet life they had built after her parents had passed years before. The Duke listened with an attention so complete that she nearly forgot the danger circling the edges of the ballroom entirely, nearly forgot Edmund Hale's cold smile and the debt that still hung over her family's future. Nearly, but not quite. As the dance drew to its close, Alina caught sight of Edmund Hale standing near the far wall, watching them with an expression that had shed all pretense of pleasantness. His eyes moved between Alina and the Duke with calculating precision, and when he noticed her looking back, he offered a slow, deliberate bow, as though acknowledging a game that had only just begun. "He is still watching," Alina said quietly as the music ended. The Duke followed her gaze, his expression hardening instantly. "Then we will need to move quickly," he said, stepping back but keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Tomorrow, I intend to speak with Mr. Pike myself, before Hale has the chance to make him an offer. If your family's debt is settled properly, cleanly, with no room for a man like Hale to insert himself into the matter, then whatever plan he is forming will have nothing left to stand upon." "You would do that, for a family you met only tonight?" "I would do that," the Duke said firmly, "because it is the right thing to do, and because I do not intend to let a man like Edmund Hale believe that cruelty and manipulation will always win simply because they move quickly." He paused, his voice softening slightly. "And because, Miss Whitmore, I find that I am not yet ready for this evening to be the last time our paths cross." Alina felt warmth rise in her chest despite the fear still coiled beneath it, a strange and unfamiliar hope threading through the uncertainty of the night. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether Edmund Hale's ambitions could truly be stopped, or whether her family's fragile safety could survive another day of scheming men and hidden debts. But for the first time since she had stepped through the gates of the Render estate, she did not feel entirely alone in facing it. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said softly, "for tonight and for whatever comes next." "Alistair," he said quietly, "if we are to face Edmund Hale together, I would prefer you use my name." Alina allowed herself a small smile despite everything. "Alistair, then." Across the room, Edmund Hale watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, already calculating his next move, already deciding that if the direct path to controlling Alina Whitmore's future had just closed, he would simply have to find another one, quieter, crueler, and far more difficult to see coming until it was already too late. The night was far from over, and neither, Alina realized with a shiver she could not quite explain, was the danger that had only just begun to circle her family's fragile world. Morning arrived at the Whitmore cottage with a knock that shattered the fragile peace Alina had carried home with her the night before. She had barely slept, her mind circling endlessly between the memory of Alistair's steady voice and the cold calculation in Edmund Hale's eyes, when the sound of fists against wood sent her rushing to the door with her heart already pounding. It was not Roland Pike standing on the step, nor his usual messenger boy who came each month to collect payment. It was a stranger dressed in fine traveling clothes, holding a sealed letter with a wax stamp Alina did not recognize, a crest showing a hawk with its wings spread wide. "A letter for Miss Alina Whitmore," the man said formally, "from Lord Edmund Hale." Alina's stomach dropped as she took the letter with trembling hands. She closed the door and broke the seal immediately, reading the words twice before their meaning fully settled into her chest like a stone. The letter informed her, in polite and carefully chosen language, that Lord Hale had purchased her family's debt directly from Mr. Pike late the previous night, for a price generous enough that Pike had accepted without hesitation. The debt, now entirely in Hale's possession, would be forgiven in full under one condition. Alina would agree to a formal engagement with Lord Hale within 1 week's time. Should she refuse, the full amount would become due immediately, with no further extensions offered. Alina read the letter a third time, searching desperately for some flaw in its logic, some escape she had not yet considered, but the trap had been built too carefully to leave any gaps. Alistair had promised to speak with Pike that very morning, to settle the debt properly before Hale could act. He had been only hours too slow. She found her aunt awake in bed, propped against thin pillows, her face pale but her eyes sharp with worry the moment she saw Alina's expression. "What has happened?" Constance asked, her voice weaker than it had been the day before. Alina sat beside her and read the letter aloud, watching her aunt's face crumble with each carefully cruel sentence. When she finished, silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "You cannot marry that man," Constance said finally, her voice trembling with a fierceness Alina had not expected from someone so ill. "I would rather lose this cottage 100 times over than see you bound to someone who would use cruelty as a courtship." "And if we lose the cottage," Alina said softly, "where would you go, Aunt Constance? Your health cannot survive the winter without shelter, and I have no other way to protect you." Neither of them had an answer, and the silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Word of Alina's situation reached the Render estate by midday, carried through the same web of servants and messengers that had carried news of her arrival at the ball only the night before. Alistair received the report from his steward with a stillness that quickly gave way to controlled fury, the kind that showed itself not in raised voices, but in the sharp, deliberate way he stood and reached for his coat. "Send word to Foley immediately," he instructed. "I want every detail of how this debt was transferred, and I want to know if there is any legal ground on which the sale can be challenged." His steward hesitated. "Your Grace, if I may, word has already begun spreading through the ton about your attentions toward Miss Whitmore last evening. If you move too visibly to intervene in this matter now, it will only confirm every rumor already circulating, and Lord Hale may use that against her as well." Alistair paused, the truth of the warning settling uncomfortably into his chest. Society moved on gossip the way rivers moved on current, unstoppable once it gathered force, and any misstep now could make Alina's situation far worse rather than better. But the alternative, standing aside while Edmund Hale forced a desperate woman into an engagement built on cruelty and coercion, was not a choice he was willing to make. "Then we will move carefully," he said, "but we will move." Across the county, in a drawing room decorated with more gold than taste, Lady Beatrice Ashford sat with her mother, listening to the very same gossip with an entirely different kind of interest. Beatrice had spent the last 3 seasons positioning herself as the most likely candidate for the Duke's attention, cultivating every advantage of birth and beauty that society valued, only to watch a woman in a plain gray dress capture his notice in a single evening. "An unadorned nobody," Beatrice said sharply, setting down her teacup with more force than necessary. "Mother, tell me this is simply idle talk and nothing more." Her mother, Lady Ashford, folded her hands with the careful patience of a woman who had navigated society's currents for decades. "It is more than idle talk, my dear. Half the ballroom witnessed the dance themselves. But do not let it trouble you. A single evening's curiosity is not the same as an engagement, and a woman with an unpaid debt and no title to her name will find society far less forgiving than you imagine." "Lord Hale has already claimed her debt," Beatrice said, having heard the news from a cousin who traveled in circles close to Hale's own. "He intends to force her hand within the week." A slow, satisfied smile crossed Lady Ashford's face. "Then the matter may resolve itself without any effort from us at all. Once she is bound to Hale, the Duke will have no further reason to concern himself with her." Beatrice considered this, though something in her still felt unsettled by how easily the Duke's attention had shifted the night before, how completely he had seemed to forget every woman in that room the moment Alina Whitmore had walked through the door. And if he does not simply let the matter resolve itself, if he intervenes? Lady Ashford's smile did not waver. "Then, my dear, We shall have to ensure he understands exactly how much he stands to lose by doing so. Alina spent the following days in a fog of dread, watching the clock tick toward the deadline Hale had set with cruel precision. She avoided venturing far from the cottage, uncertain who might be watching, uncertain whether Hale's letter had been a private threat or the opening move of a far larger scheme. On the third day, a visitor arrived that she had not expected. Alastair came alone, without the usual procession of servants that typically accompanied a man of his station, dressed simply enough that he might have passed for an ordinary gentleman rather than the most powerful man in the county. Alina met him at the garden gate, relief and worry tangled together in her chest at the sight of him. "You should not be seen here," she said quietly, glancing toward the road. "If Hale learns of this visit, he may use it against us both." "Let him," Alastair said, though his jaw was tight with restrained anger. "I have spoken with Foley. The transfer of the debt was legally sound, unfortunately. Pike had every right to sell it, and Hale structured the purchase carefully enough that there is no obvious flaw to challenge in court." Alina felt the small flicker of hope she had been carrying extinguish entirely. "Then there is nothing to be done." "There is one path," Alastair said carefully, "though I hesitate to suggest it because it is not without risk to you." "Tell me," Alina said. "I have very little left to lose." Alastair studied her for a long moment before continuing. "I could offer to purchase the debt from Hale directly, at whatever price he demands. Men like him rarely refuse an opportunity for profit, even one that costs them their original scheme. If the debt belongs to me instead, his leverage over you disappears entirely." Alina's breath caught. "You would spend your own fortune to free my family from a debt that has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Alastair said quietly, "because I cannot stand by and watch a man use desperation as a weapon against someone I have come to care for, in the span of only a few days, more deeply than I believed possible." The words settled between them, quiet and unguarded, and Alina felt her chest tighten with an emotion far more complicated than gratitude. "If you do this," she said slowly, "the entire county will know within a day. They will say you purchased my family's freedom in exchange for my hand, whether that was ever your intention or not." "Let them say what they wish," Alastair said, though his voice softened. "Unless, of course, you have no wish to be tied to me in any capacity, in which case I would simply purchase the debt as an act of charity and trouble you no further." Alina searched his face, looking for any trace of calculation, any hint that his offer carried the same cold self-interest she had seen so clearly in Edmund Hale. She found none. What she found instead made her heart ache with a hope she had not allowed herself to feel until this very moment. "I do not wish that," she admitted quietly. "Whatever the county says, whatever rumors follow, I find that I would rather face them beside you than alone." Something shifted in Alastair's expression, relief and warmth breaking through the careful restraint he had maintained since arriving. "Then I will send word to Hale this very evening, offering to purchase the debt in full. And we will see how quickly a man's cruelty crumbles when the profit he sought is placed directly in front of him." But Edmund Hale, when he received the offer the following morning, did not respond with the simple greed Alastair had hoped for. Instead, he sent back a single line, written in a hand far steadier than any honest man's should have been under the circumstances. "The debt is no longer for sale," the letter read. "I have found a more permanent solution." Alastair read the message twice, a cold unease settling into his chest that had nothing to do with the money Hale had refused. He sent immediately for Foley, demanding to know what other legal instrument Hale might have prepared, what deeper trap he might have laid while they had been focused entirely on the debt itself. It was Foley who returned 2 days later with the answer, his face grim as he laid a second document on the Duke's desk, one bearing Alina's father's signature from years before his death, a signature Alina herself had never seen. on a marriage contract drafted long ago between the Whitmore and Hale families, as part of an old business arrangement between her father and Edmund Hale's late uncle. "It appears," Foley said carefully, "that Lord Hale is not creating a new claim on Miss Whitmore's future at all. He is enforcing an old one that predates her father's death, and one that, if proven valid before a magistrate, would give him legal grounds to claim her hand regardless of her own wishes or yours." Alastair stared at the document, at the faded signature belonging to a man Alina had lost too young to ever truly know, and felt the ground shift beneath a plan he had believed, only days before, was already secure. The real danger, he realized with a sinking certainty, had not yet even begun. News of the old marriage contract spread through the county faster than either Alastair or Alina could have prepared for, carried not by careless gossip this time, but by Edmund Hale himself, who understood precisely how to use whispers as a weapon. Within 2 days, every drawing room from the Eastern Road to the Render estate buzzed with the story of a forgotten agreement between the Whitmore and Hale families, a contract that painted Alina not as a woman pursued by a cruel man, but as one already promised, already bound, long before the Duke had ever noticed her across a crowded ballroom. Alina felt the shift the moment she stepped into the village to purchase supplies for her aunt. Shopkeepers who had once greeted her warmly now offered only tight, uncertain smiles. A group of women near the market square fell silent as she passed, then resumed their conversation in lowered voices the instant she was out of earshot. She had known cruelty from poverty before. She had never known the particular sting of being discussed by strangers as though her future belonged to everyone but herself. "They believe I have deceived him," she said quietly when Alastair visited that evening, her voice tight with a frustration she rarely allowed herself to show. "They believe I encouraged your attention while secretly promised to another man." "They believe whatever Hale wishes them to believe," Alastair said, his voice hard with restrained anger. "He has spent days ensuring the story reaches every ear before we have the chance to answer it properly. It is a deliberate strategy, not an accident." Alina sat heavily in the chair near the window, exhaustion pulling at every line of her face. "Is the contract genuine?" Foley seemed uncertain. "Foley is investigating precisely that question," Alastair said. "The signature resembles your father's hand, but resemblance is not proof. I have asked him to compare it against other documents your father signed during his lifetime, business records, personal letters, anything that might reveal whether this contract is authentic or a clever forgery." "And if it is genuine," Alina asked, though the words felt like ash in her mouth, "if my father truly did promise me to Hale's family before I was even born, does that mean I have no choice in the matter at all?" Alastair knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that steadied her more than any words could have. "Whatever the contract says, Alina, no piece of paper decides your future without your consent. I do not care what agreements were made between men who are no longer living. I care what you choose now for yourself." Alina held onto his words as though they were the only solid ground left beneath her, but even his certainty could not fully quiet the fear that had taken root since Hale's letter first arrived. A magistrate had been summoned to review the contract's validity, a hearing scheduled for the end of the week that would determine, publicly and permanently, whether Edmund Hale's claim carried any legal weight at all. Meanwhile, in the drawing room of Lady Ashford's townhouse, Beatrice watched the unfolding scandal with an interest that had shifted, in recent days, from satisfaction into something closer to unease. She had expected Alina Whitmore's sudden rise in society's notice to collapse quietly, dismissed as a passing curiosity, once the season moved on to newer gossip. Instead, the Duke's continued involvement had only deepened, his visits to the Whitmore cottage becoming so frequent that even the most skeptical among society had begun to whisper about intentions far more serious than a single evening's dance. "He has not abandoned her," Beatrice said one afternoon, watching from her window as a rider carrying the Duke's crest passed along the road toward the eastern properties. Despite the contract, despite the scandal, he continues to defend her publicly. Then perhaps, her mother said slowly, setting aside her needlework with unusual deliberation, it is time we ensured Lord Hale understands the value of an ally, rather than allowing him to pursue this matter entirely alone. Beatrice turned from the window, surprised by the calculation in her mother's voice. You would align yourself with a man like Hale. I would align myself, Lady Ashford said carefully, with whatever outcome secures your future most effectively. If Hale succeeds in claiming Miss Whitmore, the Duke will require a new object of his attention once the season resumes, and I intend for that attention to fall upon you, not upon another unremarkable stranger who happens to catch his eye in a crowded room. The plan that followed was subtle, carefully constructed to avoid any appearance of direct involvement. Lady Ashford began quietly reinforcing the rumors already circulating about Alina, suggesting in careful, deniable phrases during afternoon visits that perhaps the young woman had known about the contract all along, had perhaps even encouraged Hale's interest privately while publicly appearing to reject him, using the Duke's affection merely as leverage to improve the terms of her eventual marriage. The rumor, cruel and entirely false, reached Alina 3 days before the magistrate's hearing, delivered not by a stranger this time, but by her own aunt, who had heard it from a neighbor returning from the village market. They are saying you knew, Constance said, her voice shaking with indignation on her niece's behalf, that you used the Duke's kindness as a bargaining tool against Hale, that this entire situation has been a scheme of your own making from the very beginning. Alina felt something inside her, some careful, exhausted patience she had been holding together for days, finally begin to crack. I have done nothing but try to survive, she said, her voice trembling with a fury she rarely allowed herself to feel. I did not know about this contract until Foley found it. I did not ask for Hale's attention, and I certainly did not ask for the Duke's either, though I have come to treasure it more than I ever expected to. I know that, Constance said gently, taking her niece's hands. But knowing the truth and having society believe it are two very different things, my dear. Alina spent that night unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of her small room as the weight of everything pressed down upon her at once. The contract, the rumors, the hearing only days away, and the terrible uncertainty of whether any of it could be resolved before Hale's claim became permanent. She thought of Alistair's steady presence, his quiet certainty that no piece of paper could decide her future without her consent, and tried desperately to believe it with the same conviction he had shown. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Whitmore cottage, not Alistair this time, but Mr. Foley himself, his expression carrying a mixture of urgency and cautious hope that Alina had not seen from him since the night of the ball. I believe I have found something, he said, laying several documents across the small kitchen table, his hands moving quickly between old letters and the contract Hale had presented as proof of his claim. Your father's signature on business documents from the year this contract claims to have been signed does not match the signature on the marriage agreement itself. The differences are subtle, easy to miss at first glance, but they are there. The angle of the letters, the pressure of the pen, even the ink itself appears to be of a different composition than what was commonly used during that period. Alina's heart pounded as she studied the documents Foley had laid before her, comparing the careful, familiar strokes of her father's true signature against the version presented in Hale's contract. The difference was subtle indeed, but once pointed out, it became impossible to ignore. You believe the contract is forged, she said slowly, hardly daring to hope. I believe it is very likely forged, Foley said carefully, though proving that conclusively before a magistrate will require more than my own observation. We will need an expert in documents and inks who can testify to the discrepancies with proper authority, and we have very little time to secure such testimony before the hearing. Word reached Alistair within the hour, and he arrived at the cottage with a speed that suggested he had ridden the entire distance without pause. "If the contract is forged," he said, packing the small kitchen with barely contained energy, "then Hale has committed a crime far more serious than manipulation. Forging a legal document to claim a marriage is not simply cruel, it is unlawful, and if we can prove it before the hearing, his entire scheme collapses, along with any claim he holds over your family's original debt as well." "But we have only days," Alina said, "and Foley says we need an expert whose testimony would be respected by the magistrate." Alistair was quiet for a moment, his mind clearly working through the problem with the same focused intensity Alina had come to recognize in him. "I know such a man," he said finally, "a document specialist in the city who has assisted the courts on matters of forgery before. He is not close, but if I ride tonight, I can reach him and return before the hearing begins." "That is 2 full days of hard travel," Alina said, alarm rising in her chest. "The roads at night are dangerous enough without such urgency pushing you to recklessness." "Then I will simply have to be careful and quick in equal measure," Alistair said, already moving toward the door with renewed determination. "Alina, I need you to trust me on this. Stay close to the cottage, avoid Hale and anyone connected to him until I return, and do not, under any circumstances, agree to meet with him alone, whatever excuse he might offer." Alina caught his arm before he could leave, her voice steady despite the fear coiled tightly in her chest. "Alistair, be careful. Whatever happens with the contract, whatever the hearing decides, I could not bear losing you to some accident on a dark road because of my family's troubles." Something softened in his expression, and for a brief moment the urgency of the mission fell away entirely, replaced by something quieter, more intimate. "You will not lose me," he said softly. "Not to a dark road and not to Edmund Hale. I intend to return in time, Alina, whatever it takes." He left before dawn, and Alina spent the following 2 days in an agony of waiting, watching the road from her window each hour, praying for the sight of his familiar figure returning safely with the proof they so desperately needed. Meanwhile, whispers of the approaching hearing spread through the county with growing intensity, and Edmund Hale, sensing perhaps that his advantage was beginning to slip, grew bolder in his final moves, sending a final letter to Alina the day before the hearing was set to begin. The letter contained no threats this time, only a single, chilling line that made Alina's blood run cold as she read it alone in the quiet of her small room. "Whatever proof you believe you have found, Miss Whitmore, remember that magistrates are men, and men can be persuaded far more easily than documents can be disproven." Alina stared at the words for a long time, understanding with sudden, terrible clarity that the hearing tomorrow would not simply be a matter of presenting evidence and trusting justice to prevail. Edmund Hale had spent his entire life learning how to bend outcomes in his favor, and he did not intend to lose this one without a final, desperate fight. She thought of Alistair, somewhere on the road with the proof that might save her family entirely, and prayed with everything she had left that he would return in time, and that even then, it would be enough. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and heavy with mist, the kind of weather that seemed to match the tension gathering in Alina's chest, as she dressed in the same plain gray gown she had worn to the ball weeks before, the only clothing she owned that felt appropriate for facing a room full of strangers who would decide her future. Her aunt, still weak but insistent on accompanying her, sat beside her in the small hired carriage as they made their way toward the county courthouse, neither of them speaking, both of them watching the road for any sign of Alistair's return. He had not come back the night before as promised. Alina had waited by the window until the candles burned low, hope dimming with each passing hour, until exhaustion finally forced her into a restless, fitful sleep. She woke to an empty road and a silence that felt like the worst kind of answer. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived, word of the scandal having drawn far more spectators than Alina had anticipated. She caught sight of familiar faces among the gathered crowd, some sympathetic, most simply curious, eager to witness the resolution of a story that had captivated the county for weeks. Near the front of the room, Edmund Hale sat with the composed confidence of a man who believed he had already won, his lawyer beside him arranging papers with practiced efficiency. The magistrate, an older man with sharp eyes and a reputation for careful judgment, called the hearing to order precisely on the hour, and Alina felt her stomach tighten as the proceedings began without any sign of Alastair or the expert witness he had ridden so desperately to secure. Hale's lawyer presented the marriage contract first, laying out the document with confident, practiced language, describing the arrangement between the Whitmore and Hale families as a long-standing agreement made in good faith between two respected men, one now deceased and unable to speak for himself, the other, Lord Hale, simply seeking to honor an obligation that had been unjustly delayed for far too long. Alina listened as Foley rose to offer their counter-argument, presenting his own observations about the signature's discrepancies, but without an expert witness to lend authority to his claims. The magistrate's expression remained carefully neutral, unconvinced by the word of a country solicitor alone against a document that appeared, on its surface, entirely legitimate. "Mr. Foley," the magistrate said, "your observations are noted, but without proper expert testimony to support them, I am afraid I cannot give them the weight required to dismiss a contract of this nature, unless you have such testimony prepared to present." The room fell silent, waiting. Alina's heart pounded as she glanced toward the courthouse doors, praying desperately for some sign of Alastair, but the doors remained closed, and the silence stretched unbearably long. "I do have such testimony prepared, Your Honor," Foley said finally, his voice steady despite the uncertainty clearly weighing on him, "though the witness has not yet arrived. I would ask the court's patience for a short delay, given the seriousness of the matter at hand." Hale's lawyer rose immediately, seizing the opportunity with practiced ease. "Your Honor, we cannot allow these proceedings to be delayed indefinitely on the promise of a witness who may never arrive at all. My client has waited weeks already for a resolution to this matter, and Miss Whitmore's continued evasion only further demonstrates the weakness of her position." The magistrate considered this for a long moment, his sharp eyes moving between Foley's determined expression and the confident certainty of Hale's legal counsel. "You have 30 minutes, Mr. Foley," he said finally. "If your witness has not arrived by then, this court will proceed to judgment based on the evidence presented." 30 minutes. Alina felt each second crawl past with agonizing slowness, her eyes fixed on the courthouse doors while the room around her buzzed with quiet speculation. Her aunt gripped her hand tightly, offering silent support that did little to ease the mounting dread building in Alina's chest. 20 minutes passed, then 25. Hale's confident smile grew wider with each passing moment, certain now that victory had already been secured. At the 28th minute, the courthouse doors burst open with a force that echoed through the entire room, and Alastair strode in, mud splattered across his coat, exhaustion etched into every line of his face, but his eyes burning with the same fierce determination Alina had come to know so well. Behind him followed an older gentleman carrying a leather case, moving with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to important business. "Your Honor," Alastair said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room despite his obvious exhaustion, "my apologies for the delay. The roads from the city were far worse than anticipated, but I have brought Mr. Nathaniel Ward, whose expertise in document authentication has been employed by courts across the region for over a decade. He has examined the contract in question and is prepared to offer his findings." The magistrate studied the newcomers carefully before nodding. "Very well, Mr. Ward, you may present your findings to the court." Mr. Ward stepped forward, opening his leather case with careful precision and laying out several documents alongside the disputed contract, including samples of the elder Mr. Whitmore's true signature that Foley had gathered from business records over the preceding days. "Your Honor," he began, his voice measured and authoritative, "I have conducted a thorough examination of the marriage contract presented in this case, comparing it against verified samples of the late Mr. Whitmore's handwriting from the same approximate period. The discrepancies are significant and, in my professional judgment, conclusive." He proceeded methodically, pointing out the subtle but undeniable differences in letter formation, the pressure and angle of the pen strokes, and most damningly, the composition of the ink itself, which he explained through careful chemical testing, did not match ink commonly available during the year the contract claimed to have been signed, but rather a formulation that had only become widely used within the past 5 years. "In my professional opinion," Mr. Ward concluded, "this contract was not signed by the late Mr. Whitmore at the time it claims. It is a forgery, created significantly after the date it bears, likely within the last several years rather than decades ago as presented." A murmur swept through the courtroom, and Alina watched Hale's confident expression finally crack, his composure slipping into something far more desperate as his lawyer scrambled to formulate a response. But the damage had already been done, the careful scheme he had constructed over weeks unraveling in the span of a few devastating minutes. "Your Honor," Hale said, rising suddenly, his voice losing the smooth confidence it had carried throughout the proceedings, "this testimony is clearly biased, purchased by the Duke himself to protect his own interests in this matter. I demand an independent examination." "Mr. Ward's reputation stands independent of any party in this room," the magistrate said sharply, "and his findings align precisely with the discrepancies Mr. Foley identified before your own arrival this morning, discrepancies noted before the Duke ever returned with this witness. I find the evidence of forgery compelling, Lord Hale, and I would advise you to consider your next words very carefully, given that presenting a forged document to this court is itself a serious criminal matter." The color drained from Hale's face as the full weight of the magistrate's words settled over him. What had begun as a scheme to force Alina into a convenient marriage had now transformed into a criminal charge that threatened his own freedom and reputation entirely. "I have nothing further to say," Hale managed finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury as he sat back down, the confident predator from weeks before now reduced to something far smaller and more desperate. The magistrate turned his attention back to the full courtroom, his expression grave. "Given the evidence presented, this court finds the marriage contract between the Whitmore and Hale families to be fraudulent, created recently, and falsely dated to appear as a legitimate historical agreement. This contract is hereby declared void and without legal standing. Furthermore, given the serious nature of presenting forged documents to this court, I am ordering a full investigation into Lord Hale's conduct, including the circumstances surrounding his acquisition of the Whitmore family debt, which I suspect was pursued with full knowledge of this fraudulent scheme from its inception." The courtroom erupted into a wave of murmured conversation, and Alina felt tears she had been holding back for weeks finally begin to fall, relief crashing over her so completely that she could barely remain standing. Her aunt embraced her tightly, and across the room, Alastair caught her eye, exhaustion and relief mingling in his expression as the impossible weight they had carried together finally began to lift. The proceedings continued for a few more minutes, the magistrate outlining the formal steps that would follow regarding Hale's investigation and the immediate cancellation of any claim he held over the Whitmore family's original debt, given his fraudulent conduct throughout the matter. But Alina heard little of it, her attention fixed entirely on Alastair as he made his way through the dispersing crowd toward her, his exhausted face breaking into the first genuine smile she had seen from him in days. "You came," she said softly as he reached her, unable to hold back the relief flooding through her voice. "I told you I would," he said, reaching for her hands despite the crowd of onlookers still filling the courtroom. "I am sorry for how close it came. The roads were far worse than I anticipated, and I feared for a moment that I would not reach you in time." "You reached me exactly in time," Alina said, laughing through tears that had not yet stopped falling. "You always seem to somehow." Outside the courthouse, as they walked together toward the waiting carriages, word of the hearing's outcome had already begun spreading through the gathered crowd, and Alina noticed the whispers shifting once again, curiosity now tinged with something closer to admiration rather than suspicion. She caught sight of Lady Ashford and Beatrice standing near the courthouse steps, their expressions carefully composed but unmistakably disappointed at the outcome they had quietly hoped would favor Hale's claim instead. Beatrice met Alina's eyes for a brief moment, and something unexpected passed between them, not quite an apology, but perhaps a quiet acknowledgement that the scheming and rumors of the past weeks had been unworthy of either of them. Alina offered a small nod, choosing grace over resentment, and continued walking without further exchange. 3 weeks later, the Render estate once again glowed with light for another grand ball, this one hosted specifically to celebrate the Duke's formal engagement to Miss Alina Whitmore, news that had spread through the county with a warmth entirely different from the cold gossip of weeks before. This time, when Alina arrived, she did not slip quietly through a side entrance hopping to remain unnoticed. She arrived on Alistair's arm, dressed not in silk and jewels that hid who she truly was, but in a gown of soft blue that complemented rather than concealed the same quiet, unadorned grace that had captured his attention from across a crowded room weeks before. The chandeliers still glowed as brightly as they had that first night. The music still filled every corner of the grand ballroom, but everything else had changed entirely. Where whispers had once followed her with suspicion, they now followed her with genuine warmth. Noblemen who had once looked past her without a second glance now bowed with respectful admiration, not because her circumstances had changed through wealth or title, but because they had finally seen what Alistair had recognized from the very first moment, that true worth had never required ornamentation to be recognized, only the courage to walk into a room and remain entirely, unapologetically herself. Standing at the center of the ballroom floor, surrounded by the very society that had once overlooked her completely, Alina turned to Alistair as the music began to swell around them, her heart full in a way she had never imagined possible weeks before, when she had walked through these same doors carrying nothing but a desperate hope and a plain gray dress. "Do you remember what you told me that first night," she asked softly, "about why you approached me at all?" Alistair smiled, drawing her closer as the dance began. "I told you that I had never seen anything quite like a woman who walked into a room full of people determined to impress each other, caring for nothing but the people she loved." "And now?" Alina asked, watching the light catch in his eyes. "Now," he said, "I simply cannot imagine this room or any room without you standing in it." As they moved together across the ballroom floor, watched by every nobleman who had once dismissed her and now understood, at last, exactly what the Duke had seen from the very beginning, Alina Whitmore, once unadorned and unnoticed, became the one story that every person in that room would remember for years to come, not because of jewels or silk, but because of the quiet, unshakable truth that some things, once truly seen, could never again be overlooked. The end.